We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. Premise 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause, from which it follows logically, therefore the universe has a transcendent cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. Now, from the very nature of the case, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore be immaterial, not physical. Now, there are only two possible candidates that could fit such a description. Either an abstract object like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. And therefore it follows logically that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind. And thus we are brought not merely to a first uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 2. Objective moral values and duties in the world. Our first argument gives us a transcendent personal creator of the universe, but it doesn't tell us anything about his moral character. How can we know that he is good? My second argument addresses that question. Premise 1 states, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, by objective moral values, I mean moral values which are valid and binding independently of whether people believe in them or not. Many theists and atheists agree that if God does not exist, then moral values and duties are not objective in this sense. For example, Michael Ruse, an agnostic philosopher of science, writes, morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning, just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival. So their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have evolved a similar pattern of behavior for exactly the same reason. There is a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything to make this morality objectively binding and true. Certain actions, such as rape, may not be socially advantageous. And so in the course of human development, they've become taboo in civilized society. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. Given atheism, the rapist who chooses to flout the herd morality is doing nothing more seriously than acting unfashionably, the moral equivalent, if you will, of Lady Gaga, out of step with the herd. This leads to our second premise. But objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. As philosopher Louise Anthony so nicely puts it, any argument for moral skepticism is going to be based upon premises which are less obvious than the reality of objective moral values themselves, and therefore it will never be rational to accept moral skepticism. Actions like rape, cruelty, racial hatred, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior, they're truly evil. Michael Roos himself admits, and I quote, "The man who says it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Some things, at least, are really evil. But if that is the case, then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. Some people think that the evil in the world disproves God. I think that the exact opposite is true. Real evil in the world actually proves the existence of God, since without God, to ground objective moral values, good and evil as such would not exist. Number 3, the historical facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth. Our case so far gives us a generic monotheism affirmed by Jews, Christians, Muslims, and deists alike. But do we know anything more about who this God is? To answer that question, we must look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was by all accounts a remarkable person. Historians have reached something of a consensus that Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But there are actually 3 facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 1, on the Sunday after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist, by far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the prominent New Testament critic Gerhard Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies. Fact number 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite every predisposition to the contrary. Jews had no belief in a defeated and dying Messiah, and Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the end of the world. Nevertheless, the disciples came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. N.T. Wright, an eminent New Testament scholar, concludes, "That is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and therefore was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. In summary then, I've presented a cumulative case based on the origin of the universe, the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world, and the historical facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus, for thinking that the God of Israel, the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth, actually exists. Now, if Dr. Atkins wants to have us believe atheism instead, then what he needs to do is first to tear down all three of the arguments that I presented, and then in their place erect a case of his own to prove that God does not exist. Unless and until he does that, I think we should agree that theism is the more plausible worldview.
Thank you, Professor Craig. Can I ask Professor Atkins now to give his opening presentation?
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. My immediate task, of course, is to set up my stall, not to respond to Dr. Craig's arguments at this stage. That will come later, although, as you will see, some of my remarks now will in fact touch upon what he has just raised. In fact, my task is to bring you forward from the 11th century, where you've been immersed with considerable erudition for the past 20 minutes, and bring you into the 21st century, and to present arguments based on 1,000 years of increasing knowledge about the world. Dr. Craig would have been a wonderful medieval apologist, and it's a pleasure to hear his erudite reprise, with a few elaborations, of course, of what could have been said 1,000 years ago. I do not say that scornfully. Dr. Craig has touched on arguments that have long troubled thinkers, believers, and disbelievers alike, and their longevity underlines their importance to mankind. But first, an admission. I cannot prove that God does not exist. Everything there is could be the creation of an extraordinary entity that surpasses our understanding. It could be that the universe was created only a millisecond ago, with all our memories suddenly but falsely in place. It could be, as God is outside time, whatever that meaningless phrase means, that he hasn't decided even to make us yet. It's just conceivable that God did indeed create the universe 13.7 billion years ago. I cannot prove that he did not. All I can do is to assemble evidence that leads to the conclusion that God is not necessary for any aspect of the current world, and that there is a far simpler explanation for everything than the assertion of the existence of an omnipotent God. I have to say, of course, that many hold that the assertion that God made it is far, far simpler as an explanation of everything than a more pedestrian account in terms of physical laws. God, they say, is surely a simpler explanation than complex mechanism. Don't be seduced. The assertion that God did anything is simplistic rather than simple, and it is lazy. It is simplistic because an entity as functionally unbounded as a God must be of extraordinary complexity. It is lazy because it avoids becoming involved in untangling the web of events that have led to us. Any argument that simply asserts that God did it is a sign of a lazy mind, a mind that is content to wallow in assertion rather than embark upon climbing the intellectual Everest of comprehension.